courthouses of Texas are in many ways a reflection of the growth and development of Texas as a state. You know, we started out as a very much on a frontier condition, and over the course of the latter part of the 19th century and early parts of the 20th century, we became more and more civilized. We began to build a society that very much is the Texas that we know today. These courthouses would act as centers for their communities, both symbolically, this is where your parades would go by, but also economically. Individuals from throughout the county would come to this town, would come to do business at the courthouse, and as a result, you had businesses, whether they be restaurants or saddleries, that would grow up in its shadow, that would ride the coattails of the fact that you had this government institution in its place. And so in many cases, you see the development of the square around the courthouse as being these little seeds, these little islands of density in an otherwise fairly rural environment. So the rise of the sort of grand Victorian courthouses that you tend to associate with courthouse buildings in Texas came about in the 1880s and 1890s. And what was going on at the time was you see sort of Texas finally sort of recovering from Reconstruction and the rise of both the cotton and cattle industries. So for the first time, Texas wasn't just a poor rural state. It was still rural, but it began to have sort of the economic ability to invest in public architecture. Now that was partnered with the fact that the Texas legislature passed a law basically allowing counties to pass bonds to pay for public buildings. So in addition to having larger treasuries to begin with, they were also now able to basically take out loans in order to invest in the architecture that again matched their ambitions as well as their budgets. So in the 1990s, the Hill County Courthouse in Hillsborough basically burned to the ground. It was sort of this cataclysmic fire that reduced it essentially to the stone walls. And there was very much a discussion about whether or not it should be torn down and rebuilt, or if they should try and restore it. And in the case of Hill County, it was this heroic community-wide effort, and they rebuilt it. What this drove home for legislators is that these buildings are a critical part of our heritage, of who we are. Counties are charged by the state to do a lot of different things, whether it's running the justice system or maintaining roads. They're not always in a position to restore these buildings in the way that they really need to be. Like anything that's 100 years old needs to be restored. What state leaders realized was that in order to preserve this very critical part of our cultural heritage, there needed to be funds made available. Just like when these buildings were originally built, the state was able to put in a mechanism by which these counties could afford to build the buildings they needed to. The state created a very similar system of grants. The restoration process is a very complicated one. There is a remarkable amount of just forensic work that goes into figuring out what these buildings originally looked like and how they originally worked. So in the case of the Comal County Courthouse that we're currently in, they didn't really know. They had some sets of drawings. They had a few photographs from when it opened. They had a few photographs of a major trial that occurred in this space. But something as simple as knowing what the original paint colors were, they had no way of knowing until they got in, started scraping off the layers of paint, 100 years worth of paint, and actually found this building was pink. Who would have known? And so if you actually go through the building now and see sort of the soft pastel tones of the room that we're in now, the bluish tones of the public spaces, it's this incredibly sophisticated color palette that you had no way of knowing that was there. In addition, there is an art to integrating modern building systems into a historic structure. So, for example, this building was not built to have air conditioning and the ducts and the mechanical systems that are required to keep a building in Texas cool. And so one of the things architects are required to do when they do these restorative efforts is to figure out a way to integrate those systems, both in terms of the large mechanical ducts as well as the technology. Today, it's easy to look back on these courthouses as sort of nostalgic artifacts of a time and place, long gone, sort of back when life was simpler and towns were smaller and we had a better sort of opinion of government. But what I've come to find about these buildings is that they aren't reflective of a time that was. They are reflective of a future that we wanted. They were built as a future that these towns wanted to have, that these communities wanted to see their place in Texas to grow into. They continue to act as the centers of their communities, both economically, in terms of you see these sort of tightly developed commercial districts around them, and they very much become symbols of their communities, whether or not they're lighted during the holidays, they're decorated for the parades as they move through these towns on the 4th of July. They're very much the living center of their communities and continue to be so, to act as both the symbolic and the physical heart of these places throughout the state of Texas.